It was the year 1944, and the war in Europe was reaching its chaotic crescendo. German soldiers, exhausted and battle-worn, were being captured in droves as Allied forces pushed relentlessly from every front. On the docks of a bustling European port, hundreds of these prisoners of war were herded onto a massive American transport ship bound for the United States. Their uniforms were tattered, boots scuffed from endless marches, and faces etched with fatigue and the weight of survival. Each man carried not only a rifle, but also a heavy burden of uncertainty, fear, and questions about what lay ahead in a land most had never seen. The port was alive with activity. American soldiers shouted precise orders in a language the prisoners only partly understood, while cranes moved crates with meticulous care and steam hissed from engines, mingling with the sharp tang of salt and coal that filled the air. The prisoners glanced at one another, some with suspicion, others with the faintest spark of curiosity. Among them were hardened veterans, men who had seen cities crumble under fire and the chaos of collapsing armies, and young recruits barely out of their teens, haunted by the horrors of their first battle. The ship itself was a looming fortress of steel, its sheer size dwarfing the men as they were guided down into the lower decks. Below, the confined spaces pressed against them, wooden floors cold and damp beneath their boots, narrow metal-lined walls rattling with each movement. Whispers filled the air, prayers muttered under the breath, speculation about the unknown territory ahead. Outside, the Atlantic swelled ominously. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, casting gray shadows over restless waves that lashed against the hull, as though the ocean itself was testing the resolve of those aboard. The engines roared to life, and the massive vessel began its journey westward, carrying the prisoners further from everything familiar. Nights on the ship were unbearable for some. The vessel swayed unpredictably, creaking and groaning, while the wind screamed past. Soldiers clung to narrow benches, trying to sleep as the constant motion gnawed at their nerves. They whispered quietly, recounting fragments of battles survived, friends lost, and the families they longed to see once more. Leadership hierarchies emerged even in captivity, older officers commanding attention and respect, guiding younger men through fear and uncertainty. Every sound, the deck creaking, water thrashing, distant thunder, felt magnified, a reminder that their journey was as perilous as any battlefield. They had left one war zone only to face another unknown challenge spanning thousands of miles. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before them, dark and uncharted, reflecting the turmoil inside every soldier. Some speculated about America, imagining sprawling cities and endless fields, while others feared a land filled with strangers who might offer no mercy. Yet, even in monotony and fear, small moments of humanity endured. Soldiers shared meager rations, whispered jokes, drew fleeting smiles, and camaraderie formed under the strangest circumstances. Each day was a step closer to a new reality, one that would forever change the men who had survived so much, and yet still had no idea what awaited them on the shores of a distant world. The year was 1944, and after weeks at sea, the German prisoners of war finally caught sight of land. Their eyes widened as the outline of the American coast emerged through the early morning fog, a mixture of awe, disbelief, and lingering fear gripping every man. The massive transport ship slowly docked at the bustling port, and the prisoners were herded off with precision and strict control. American guards moved with a confident efficiency that seemed almost theatrical to the weary soldiers, every step deliberate, every gesture commanding order. The prisoners had imagined harsh punishments, brutal interrogations, and unimaginable cruelty, yet what they encountered was the opposite. Civilians and soldiers alike observed the captives, curiosity in their eyes rather than hostility. The German men whispered to one another, disbelief mingling with a cautious sense of relief. Their first steps onto American soil were tentative. Each footfall echoed with the weight of the unknown, the cold concrete beneath their boots, a stark contrast to the rolling waves they had left behind. Massive warehouses, trucks, and vehicles moved with a precision that seemed impossible. Flags fluttered in the crisp autumn wind, and the air carried a mix of coal, engine oil, and faint traces of the ocean. The prisoners were guided past towering cranes and bustling docks, their eyes tracing the movement of soldiers and workers with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Some tried to read the expressions of their captors, searching for hidden hostility, while others quietly marveled at the scale and organization of it all. The sun broke through the fog in thin streaks, illuminating the vastness of the port and casting long shadows that seemed to exaggerate the size of the ship and the men themselves. Every detail was overwhelming. The prisoners had imagined an alien land filled with danger, yet America presented a complex mixture of efficiency, civility, and quiet power that none of them had anticipated. As they were led toward the waiting transport trucks, a young soldier dared to glance around, taking in the orderly chaos of cranes, cargo, and movement. The scale of it all made him feel insignificant, a tiny figure adrift in a meticulously orchestrated world that functioned without visible chaos. Older soldiers exchanged brief, tense words, debating whether this treatment was genuine or a clever deception. Some feared a trap, convinced that their lives would change instantly from cautious optimism to brutal punishment. The trucks rolled along paved roads, transporting the prisoners inland. Each man held his posture rigid, eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Fields stretched in orderly rows, factories puffed smoke into the sky, and small towns flashed past, revealing houses painted in bright, unfamiliar colors, streets filled with civilians moving calmly and efficiently. The contrast to war-torn Europe could not have been starker. Soldiers could not help but notice the absence of rubble, the quiet smiles of children playing near sidewalks, and the lack of fear in the faces of ordinary people. Suspicion battled curiosity. Some men clutched their caps in anxious hands, unsure whether this peaceful appearance hid hidden threats. Others found themselves wondering if they had imagined the brutality they had been trained to expect, questioning the stories drilled into them since youth. Conversations were cautious, filled with fragmented words and hesitant questions. The older soldiers maintained vigilance, warning the younger ones to observe, learn, and do nothing that might attract attention. Yet even with fear present, all began to seep in. The land, the people, and the sheer order of American life struck them with a force far greater than any battlefield confrontation. Each passing mile brought new revelations. The prisoners began to understand that this journey was not only a movement across oceans, but also a passage into a world they had never truly imagined. A world that would challenge their assumptions, shake their beliefs, and confront them with a reality far beyond the horrors of war they had known. Every man felt the silent weight of history pressing down on him, realizing that this first day in America was not merely an arrival, but the beginning of a transformation that would change how they understood the world, themselves, and the very nature of what it meant to be a soldier captured far from home. After arriving on American soil in 1944, the German prisoners of war were transported to a POW camp deep inland, a place that contrasted sharply with the devastation and chaos they had left behind in Europe. The camp spread across rolling fields, fenced and secure, yet far from the brutality they had been trained to expect. Wooden barracks lined the perimeter, their windows clean, the roofs intact, and the grounds meticulously maintained. The prisoners stepped out of the trucks and onto paths that were swept clean, the crunch of their boots on gravel, loud in the still morning air. Their eyes darted to every corner, scanning for signs of traps, hidden weapons, or any hint that the civility before them was an illusion. Guards moved around in disciplined formation, speaking in calm, precise tones, their demeanor professional but not hostile. The prisoners were assigned to barracks according to rank, each group guided to its designated area where simple bunks, blankets, and a modest amount of personal space awaited. It was a far cry from the fear and squalor of battlefields, yet the Germans approached it with suspicion. Meals were served on long wooden tables with rationed but adequate portions, the smell of cooked meat and bread filling the air. Some of the prisoners hesitated before taking the food, uncertain if there was some hidden danger in the unfamiliar meals. Others, driven by hunger and the instinct to survive, ate quickly, their eyes constantly scanning the room for anything amiss. As the day progressed, the prisoners were introduced to their first tasks. Some worked in the fields, tending crops under the watchful eyes of the guards. Others assisted in maintaining the camp infrastructure, repairing fences, carrying supplies, and performing labor that was demanding but fair. It was not punishment. It was work that carried purpose, yet the Germans found themselves conflicted. The soldiers had been trained to expect cruelty, and the fairness of their assignments challenged every preconceived notion. Conversations emerged among the prisoners, hushed and cautious as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Young recruits marveled at the order, the clean uniforms of the guards, and the efficiency of the operations. Older men, skeptical and hardened by experience, warned that appearances could be deceiving, reminding their comrades that the unknown often concealed danger. Despite the skepticism, small moments of humanity began to emerge. A guard smiled briefly at a prisoner struggling with a task, and a whispered thank you was exchanged, bridging the gap between captor and captive in a fleeting moment of recognition. Even in labor, the prisoners found themselves learning, observing, and adapting. The day moved slowly but purposefully, each task reinforcing a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of war. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the neatly arranged barracks and fields, the prisoners paused to take stock of their situation. They had survived battles, endless marches, and the uncertainty of capture. Yet the experience of this first day in the camp unsettled them in a different way. The absence of fear, the presence of order, and the unexpected civility created a cognitive dissonance that none of them had anticipated. Some began to quietly reflect on the world outside the camp walls, glimpsing towns in the distance, children playing near fences, and the slow, steady hum of normal life continuing as if the war had not reached here. Others remained guarded, unwilling to let their minds wander, fearing that acceptance of kindness would make them vulnerable. By the end of the day, the German prisoners of war had begun to understand that this experience was unlike anything they had ever known. The first day of work, the orderly routines, and the surprising humanity surrounding them planted the first seeds of realization that the world beyond the battlefield could be as complex, structured, and unpredictable as any war they had fought. They had crossed oceans and left behind destruction, only to find themselves in a place that challenged every assumption about enemies, captivity, and survival. The first day in the camp had done more than place them in a new environment. It had begun to alter their perception, forcing them to confront ideas they had never considered, and preparing them for the days to come, where understanding, observation, and adaptation would become their most powerful tools for endurance and survival. As the days progressed in 1944, the German prisoners of war began to experience what they could only describe as culture shock, a reality far removed from the war-torn landscapes of Europe they had known. Supervised trips outside the camp introduced them to small American towns that seemed almost untouched by the violence consuming the world elsewhere. Streets were clean, lined with wooden houses painted in light, cheerful colors. Children ran and played in the open, their laughter echoing in the crisp air, a sound so alien it made the prisoners stop mid-step. The soldiers could not comprehend this normalcy, the quiet routines and the absence of fear in the faces of ordinary civilians. Marketplaces bustled with people exchanging goods. Workers walked purposefully to factories, and townsfolk greeted one another with casual smiles. Everything was orderly, predictable, and yet filled with life, a stark contrast to the chaos and destruction of their homeland. The German soldiers walked through these streets with measured steps, their eyes wide and constantly scanning for hidden dangers. Some gripped their caps tightly, hesitant to let themselves be drawn into the unfamiliar world, while others allowed themselves brief glimpses of wonder at the efficiency and vitality surrounding them. They observed children tossing baseballs in backyards, women carrying baskets, and men working steadily in shops, all oblivious to the war raging across the ocean. Each scene challenged the lessons they had been taught, the propaganda that had painted Americans as enemies to fear and despise. In hushed conversations, the older soldiers debated what they were witnessing, warning the younger men that appearances could be deceiving and that the world outside could still hide threats. Yet, curiosity grew stronger than suspicion in many of the younger prisoners. They found themselves comparing the peaceful scenes before them with the ruined streets and bombed-out villages they had left behind. The contrast was stark, and for the first time, some began to question the narratives they had been fed since childhood. Small acts of kindness left the prisoners disarmed and bewildered. A child waved shyly from a porch, a shopkeeper offered bread with a smile, and even the guards displayed patience and civility in ways the Germans had never expected. The prisoners had been trained to expect cruelty, to assume that mercy was a tactic or a trap. Yet here they found humanity expressed openly and without fear. The cultural differences were profound. Language barriers created moments of confusion, yet gestures, shared work, and cautious smiles bridged gaps more effectively than words. Soldiers began learning to read cues, to understand manners, and to observe habits that were foreign and fascinating. The camp itself became a lens through which they interpreted the world outside. Every visit to a nearby town or farm provided new evidence that life could continue in structured, peaceful ways, even amidst global conflict. They began noticing rhythms, routines, and values that contrasted sharply with survival-driven existence in Europe. By midday, the prisoners were returning to camp with minds swirling with contradictions. The safety and order they experienced clashed with every instinct drilled into them during years of war. Some wrote letters home, cautiously describing their experiences in ways that attempted to reconcile disbelief with reality. Others kept their observations private, unable to articulate the profound internal dissonance they felt. Evening brought reflection. The sun dipped behind distant hills, casting long shadows over the camp, illuminating the faces of men deep in thought. Some stared silently, contemplating how this day had challenged assumptions about enemies, captivity, and survival. The first real encounters with American culture had done more than surprise them. They had unsettled beliefs, forced reevaluation, and planted seeds of understanding that would grow in the days to come. The German prisoners of war had begun a transformation that extended beyond physical captivity, reaching into the very core of perception and comprehension. And they knew deep down that the experiences of this day would forever alter their view of the world, their roles as soldiers, and their expectations of humanity. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the American landscape in 1944, casting long shadows across the camp where German prisoners of war were confined. This first day of reflection, labor, observation, and cultural exposure had imprinted itself deeply on every man present. They had crossed oceans, endured the perils of stormy seas, and left behind destruction, only to confront a reality that challenged every assumption they had carried since childhood. Silence filled the camp in the early evening, broken only by the distant sounds of children playing in nearby towns and the occasional bark of a guard dog. The prisoners stood in small clusters, watching as light faded and the world seemed to hold its breath. Some were still processing the normalcy they had witnessed, the order, the civility, and the humanity that seemed so effortlessly expressed in this distant land. Others wrestled with internal conflict, torn between the lessons of war and the evidence of daily life around them. They had been trained to see enemies as monsters, as obstacles to conquer or destroy. Yet the Americans they had encountered were neither cruel nor vengeful. They were humans, working, laughing, and living in ways that the prisoners had never believed possible. Each prisoner felt a subtle shift within himself, a mental and emotional adjustment forced by the reality before them. The older soldiers remained cautious, observing patterns, studying routines, and guiding younger comrades to remain vigilant. Still, even they could not deny the strange allure of the peaceful existence that surrounded the camp. Conversations were hushed but revealing, men questioning assumptions, sharing observations, and quietly admitting awe at the efficiency, civility, and humanity of their captors. The first day in America had done more than place them in a foreign land. It had altered the very lens through which they viewed the world. Some gazed across the fields, seeing crops meticulously tended, workers returning home with steady steps, and towns alive with orderly routines, and could not reconcile this image with the war and devastation they had known. Others focused inward, examining the unease and curiosity growing within them, realizing that survival required adaptation not only to physical conditions, but also to the psychological reality of a world far more complex than battle lines or propaganda had ever suggested. By nightfall, a quiet contemplation took hold. The prisoners gathered near barracks windows or leaned against fences, watching the final rays of sunlight glinting off distant rooftops. Thoughts turned to home, to families, and to the inconceivable notion that life could continue in such normality while war raged elsewhere. The first day had been exhausting physically, emotionally, and mentally, yet it had illuminated truths that no battlefield could teach. It revealed that captivity did not have to mean cruelty, that enemies could possess dignity, and that humanity could persist even in the midst of global conflict. Letters were written cautiously, reports filed, and thoughts exchanged in whispers as men attempted to reconcile disbelief with reality. This day had altered perceptions irrevocably, planting seeds that would grow as weeks passed, challenging the very narratives that had guided them as soldiers. The first day in America had left them with something more powerful than freedom or confinement. It had left them with understanding, a perspective on life and humanity that no soldier could have anticipated. As darkness fell, the prisoners stared at the stars emerging over unfamiliar fields, contemplating the vastness of the world and the unlikelihood of the journey that had brought them here. They had survived the horrors of war and the uncertainties of capture, and yet the greatest challenge now was internal, the reconfiguration of beliefs, fears, and expectations. Every man knew that this first day would remain etched in memory, a turning point, where shock became reflection, suspicion became curiosity, and captivity became a gateway to insight. The first day in America had changed everything, and every prisoner understood that the experiences of this day would influence how they perceived the world, their own identities, and the very notion of what it meant to be a soldier far from home in a land that defied every expectation they had carried across oceans and continents.